Okay, yeah, so this is the overview of the methodology and the guidance document, and Steve Crooks will also come up toward the end and have a few things to say about the guidance document. So that's one of the last slides I had up, was on how we got to where we are in the project development, where we are. I didn't show this earlier. We're trying to use blue carbon as a driver for projects that have mitigation value, adaptation to sea level rise, right, and trying to conserve these habitats that we care about, and also restoration and conservation of existing habitats, right? So that's how I think about it in one way, kind of schematically. And getting to Lisa Marie's question a little bit, really people are would want to do a carbon project for two reasons. One is that you want to do climate mitigation. You want to have a nice positive effect from a greenhouse gas perspective. And secondly is that you want to find funding for the project you want to do. And so it's really a balance between those things. And in our case, it's additional funding for ecological restoration. Okay, I don't think there's going to be people getting rich off carbon markets for blue carbon. It'd be okay if they did, in my mind, as long as we're creating ecologically appropriate projects. And so when you think about doing a project, and as I start to go through some of what's in the methodology, you need to be considering the carbon finance component from the very beginning, as opposed to, hey, I've got this great restoration project, can I add carbon finance at the end? And I mean, there will be exceptions to that, but just to keep that in mind. Okay, so David kindly showed our cover page earlier for the methodology. Thank you, David. Why we did this, we wanted, first of all, to provide that link between carbon finance and restoration. Tana Marie mentioned at the very beginning today, there's a huge funding need for habitat restoration. We've lost so much. We continue to lose habitat, even in the US with our protections that we have. And we need a lot of money, to sort this out. And pots are starting to emerge in different places, thanks to the frenemies, another good word, that whoever said that one, was that, anyway, of the various storms and spills and stuff. So we also want to make sure that we're supporting ecologically appropriate projects, scientifically credible offsets, and that are meeting the requirements of the greenhouse gas standards. We want this to be broadly applicable to restoration. We're, like I said, a national mission-driven organization. We can create one tool that everyone can use, and it's effective. We'd rather do that than create 6 different ones for different kinds of restoration or different geographies. And also allow some flexibility and practicality, right? We want this to be something that you can use in the field as you're designing your projects. Those were our goals. It's not yet on the streets, so we're hoping that we've met them. It takes a lot of very smart people to do this, and this is a list of hopefully everybody who's contributed directly to the methodology work. We submitted it to the Verified Carbon Standard over a year ago to begin their validation process, and basically it's 2 independent reviewers and the VCS and a public review period, and we're about 5/7 of the way through that. So we are in the second validation right now, and then the VCS has already reviewed it, the public's already seen it, and we've already done the first validation. So I used to say, well, in a few months it should be done, but now I know better because these things take longer than we think they will. This is new territory that we're exploring. So I would just say sometime this year we'll have it ready to go. In the meantime, you can access it on the VCS website. Just search wetlands. It'll come up, and you can take a look at it, and you can start to think about, are there places that you want to apply this? And you can start to think about how to use it, even though doesn't have its final seal of approval yet. Will you let me know when there's more like 10 minutes left, so Steve has a few? Okay. I don't know if you can read this from the back. So these are just the chapter headings and some of what's in them, and I won't go into detail here, but basically it's applicability conditions. When are you allowed to use this? Your project boundary, you have to set a spatial and a temporal and a greenhouse gas boundary. for your project. You have to define all the parameters around it. You have to determine your baseline scenario, what would happen if you did nothing. You have to address additionality. I haven't spoken about additionality yet, but it's the idea that we don't want to provide offsets for something that was really going to happen anyway, or that was required to happen, like a wetland mitigation bank. That's something that's required, and so if we allow an offset for that, it doesn't really affect the greenhouse gas total, right? It was already going to happen. We're trying to bring it down from where it is now. And then you have to, and then it includes a lot of text on quantification, how you go out and measure this and demonstrate the benefits you've created, and monitoring as well. So I'm pleased to say that it covers all tidal wetland and seagrass habitat restorations globally. And that's because there's, in terms of greenhouse gas accounting, there's not a lot of difference between how you do it and what the basic processes are. I have to be careful when I say things like that with a lot of scientists in the room. But and our definition of restoration is one that is also broad. So it's changing the hydrology, changing the sediment supply, changing the salinity, introducing or reintroducing native plants, improving water quality, any of those things, all pointing towards a long-term sustainable ecological condition, right? And specifically, these are some of the things that you could do with our methodology, that you could apply our methodology to. So removing tidal restrictions, and there's a lot of examples of that in New England and on the East Coast. Beneficial use of, I'm not going to list all of the, say them all out loud, you can read them, but beneficial use of dredge material, so creating new wetland islands from dredge spoil. Reducing nutrient loads in water to improve clarity and get seagrass regrowth, or to go out and plant seagrasses as you're doing that. So those are just some examples. And I should say our methodology is only for restoration. We are also starting to work on one that will be for conservation, for protection of existing coastal wetland systems. Oh, I have to mention leakage. Okay, so you don't want to displace an activity from where your project is to another location that has harmful greenhouse gas impacts. It's easier to think of in a protection scenario. If you displace a developer 10 miles down the road, they're going to impact something else 10 miles down the road. You haven't really made an impact, a net impact, when you compare that site, right? So you don't want to allow that. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip these because I want to talk about more what's in here. I'm going to skip that too. All right, so it does cover all three major greenhouse gases that I talked about earlier, in the plants, in the soil, and emissions during your project. So if you use if you use fuel, you're going to have emissions. And also how to do that for the baseline and your project scenarios. For the flexibility side, and to get to the monitoring question, to do your accounting, you can use published literature values. You can use default values that we provide, and it's 1.46 tons of carbon, not CO2, per hectare per year. You can use emission factors. You can use field data, so you can go out and collect it. You can use proxies or models, and you have to be able to justify your approach. So you can't just use literature from a Mexican salt marsh for a New England project. You'd have to say why, that would be a good comparison. And if the science is insufficient, the burden is on you to prove that what you're doing is accurate. And markets are conservative, which means that they want you to underestimate everything just in case you're wrong. So that's built into the methodology as well. All right, I mentioned that. So you can use default values, and this is based on global literature values. Oh, that's it. Good timing, because I see Steve in the wings. So we're going to pass the baton.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to be really quick because I'm going to cover some of this later on this afternoon. Is it this one? Yeah. So when we when we're pulling this together, there's a couple of other things coming out. When you read these methodologies, they're very condensed text. You know, it's all procedures. There is no description in there of why the procedures are what they are. It's just the procedures. So if you've ever read the back of a credit card statement with like the last 3 pages, it kind of looks a lot like that. So sorry, Gino, who writes these things and enjoys them. They are a beautiful piece of work because they are so precise, but they require a lot of interpretation. So there's a couple of documents coming out in the next few months, one of which we're producing a paper to go to the peer review science community, explaining the rationale behind what we put in the methodology. You know, sometimes we have to be, we try to be precise, but assumptions are made. And then when you make assumptions, you have to be conservative in how you apply them. And so we're going to be setting forth the rationale of what is in the methodology as part of this scientific paper, and that's coming out, hopefully submitted in September. Another document that's coming out is more for the practice side, for the wetland science side of this. How do we, as wetlands restoration practitioners, take a document like this and actually apply it in the field conditions? What does it all mean? So we have this document, which is hopefully going to be done in the next month. It's just about to go to be laid out for publication. This is the table of contents. So we've got an introduction to blue carbon and blue carbon financing, some background on what it is to generate a carbon asset, and what does this mean in terms of land use and coastal wetland sectors. We talk about what the restoration, wetland restoration and conservation under the VCS is. So we're focused on the VCS when we develop the methodology, and this is how to work with the VCS effectively. And then we get into the sort of steps of how do you build a feasibility study, and I'll come to this later on this afternoon. And then we actually get down to chapter 5 of what is actually in the methodology. How do you go about the procedures of greenhouse gas accounting for the different greenhouse gases? How do you think about additionality, etc. And then the process of the registration and which institutions and stakeholders do you work with, more about carbon markets and asset management. And then we have a special section at the end, which I am going to talk a little bit more this afternoon about grouping projects. Because when you think about the forestry sector, most projects are, 10,000 hectares in size or more. A friend of mine's got an offsets company in Vancouver, and he's talking 1 million credits. That's the kind of scale that they think of for forestry. But we're talking about wetlands projects, which are much smaller. But luckily, there is a way of grouping these projects together within one larger project, lots of smaller projects. And that's going to be very important when we think about places like New England, where you're thinking about maybe reconnecting small wetlands back to tidal circulation. So I'll talk about that. So basically, that's what's in the guidance document. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy to wave around here today, but it's going to be out before the end of this project in June. Thank you. Nope, I think we're done. Yep, we can do questions, sure. And just a reminder, so tomorrow we have a more in-depth session to get a little bit more into the weeds, because I skimmed over a lot of things, more just so you know what's in the methodology and where you might be able to think about start using it. So tomorrow we can start to get into some of that depth during the Q&A now if we want also.
Yeah, for Steve or Steve, in the context of carbon markets, it seems like, you know, with respect to wetlands restoration, if we had markets where we could sell all the eco services in some bundled fashion, it might facilitate more project implementation. Do you guys see any way of moving something forward in that regard?
I think that would be fantastic. It's not something I've looked into. It's been pretty daunting just to get these into the carbon markets. It'd be a great question for David. I think he left shortly, very recently, but and I'm intrigued by that. So the social cost of carbon, it came up earlier today, was roughly $41 a ton, I think. The market price for carbon is, $5 to $13 a ton, well, a lot of variables in there. And so it's bridging that gap just for carbon, and then there's a huge gap on all these other ecosystem services. And I think we probably need a lot more work on valuation and methods for valuation and to make it more systematic, much in the way that having these carbon standards has really forced us to provide this methodology that everyone can use. And so that there's consistent accounting, consistent approaches to accounting. That would probably get us partway there. And write your representative or senator, right? I don't know. Yeah.
There is that general separation between funds that go to mitigation and funds that go to adaptation. And when people build these projects, they try and connect the two, so you can connect and try and stack different benefits. But even still, you know, when you look at the global discussions, most of the money is going into the big greenhouse gas mitigation funding streams, even though there's a recognition that they need to be doing adaptation, like the Green Fund, etc. So they're not very well tied together as yet. You know, one of the first blue carbon projects that exists is in Kenya, and it's at the village scale, and it's a reforestation of mangroves. And the villagers got really excited about it, and they're engaged in it, and it's a very nice project because they want their fisheries to come back. And so they want mangroves to come back. And the fact that some people in Norway or England or Australia or the US who want to buy carbon for these mangroves is there, well, that's great, but they don't care about that. They care about there's actually funding streams coming in that help them rebuild their fisheries, which is their motivation. So that gap that exists between the social cost or the true cost of carbon and the monetary carbon cost of it is something that we really do need to close, and it's not done very well yet.
Hi. I'll insert another piece of information. I participated in the low gas study, which happened toward the end of last year, and did some calculations of my own. There were about, I estimate, 24 environmental groups disagreeing with the study, and the governor now thinks the study is simple fact. But what I did and didn't really report in my comments on the study was that if you do planning, the planning value for carbon, I put in $147 per ton, and it barely balanced out options. You'd like to see solar and wind and some of the renewable things coming in over a 20 to 50 year period, at least equal to increasing your gas consumption. So if you use that criterion, you get 147 approximately, and I've heard numbers, you know, off the top of somebody's head as high as $200 per ton. And I would tend to agree with those numbers, and I think we have to get them up there. And what I guess the question is, what impact would that have on what you're doing and what we're doing? I'm John Carlton Foss from Strategic Energy Systems.
Well, if you're offering $200 a ton, that's sold. So at $5 a ton, as Steve mentioned, there's a scale question. There's costs of entering the carbon market. You know, to do all the planning and the verification and the field work you might have to do over a long period of time takes resources. And so you need a certain scale to make it more worthwhile. Ramping up the price would bring down the scale and would also then be able to cover a greater portion of the project costs. In the land use sector, I think it's the case that very few projects, so forestry, for example, very few forestry projects does the carbon finance pay for the whole project. It's added income, just like we would envision for blue carbon finance. But I think we'd be looking at a much greater scale, and the ability to, a much smaller scale of project size would be opened up, and again, could cover more of the costs. So it'd be great. Yeah. You want to add anything to that?
Just a little, yeah, well, restoration is funding limited, so if we had a more reasonable price, there would be a lot more of it, and more conservation. You know, in taking this overseas again, if we just think about West Papua, there's just under 1 billion tons of carbon at risk right now in West Papua underneath the mangroves. And the reason they're not at risk immediately right now is that the mining industry is in the forest and in the mountains. And but that mining resource is about to expire within the next 20 years. So all those people who are funded under the mining industry there are now going to be looking to do what everybody else in Indonesia is doing, and that's cutting down the mangroves. what's needed is a more appropriate pricing to try and provide mechanisms for places like that for conservation. If you can keep 1 billion tons of carbon in the ground, that's a pretty big successful activity. But just generally with the restoration as well. There was something else I was going to say. No, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Speaking about mangroves, I direct an international project called Mangrove Encode in many of all the tropical countries really that used to have mangroves. We have a solution for that. Just ask the US government to inspect what's the content of glyphosate and other chemicals in the shrimp and fish that we are importing from those countries, and that will do it. The mangroves will be back because they will not be exploited by these industries. Simple. If we care about the American seafood supply, we will make an impact on mangrove conservation. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this opportunity. One of the things that raises for us, if shrimp imports has an enormous carbon footprint, and that's because to grow shrimp, you chop down mangroves in the tropics. It releases all the soil from the peats underneath, and the shrimps, the ponds only last maybe 10 years on average before they have to move on. It is the modern day slash and burn agriculture of the world. One shrimp meal, one shrimp cocktail, you can drive over 1,000 miles in terms of the carbon footprint of that meal. It's one of the most highest carbon impacts that we have. In the US and Australia and Europe and Japan, import enormous quantities of shrimp from places like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and all these places. If we were to do that, if we were to do something, if we were to hold our imports to the same standards as what we do in the US, we could have a very significant impact in terms of the carbon footprint here. Perhaps one of the most significant impacts we could have in terms of the blue carbon community would be that. So tying that together, the carbon footprint with all the other aspects of that comes with imported shrimp, like the glyphosate, etc. If we had sustainable shrimp fisheries in that regard, that would be very beneficial for this kind of process. I totally agree.
I'm going to add one more comparison because we both really love these numbers. So Boone Kaufman is the scientist who did a lot of this estimating for the land use carbon impact of farmed shrimp like this from cleared mangroves. And he also compared it to Amazon raised beef, right? So if you have a steak and the cow came from the Amazon where they clear cut the forest and graze the cow, and there, so 1 pound steak, big meal, I think it was 20 pounds of a CO2 emission. The shrimp, for 1 pound of shrimp, was 2,000 pounds, so it was 100 times greater. This is just looking at the land use impact. There's other impacts too, transportation and all kinds of energy costs and things like that. But not that you should eat either necessarily, but it puts it in perspective, I think.
It is a quick one. I'm Karen Gudan from University of Maryland. I was just wondering who connects buyers and sellers, for example, in your village project with the mangrove forest, who connected them to the Norwegian buyers?
In that case, it's a non-profit. They went through a small type of registry called Plan Vivo. And then there's a non-profit who was acting as the broker. And I don't think it's the bigger entities have more capacity, I think, for connecting these things together. I actually tried to buy credit, and I found it a little bit difficult to do so. But there are groups out there who will do this kind of thing. One of the nice things also about the voluntary market is you negotiate the price. So if you're an organization with a strong conservation or socio-environmental responsibility, you can pay whatever price you're willing to pay effectively. So you can go above the compliance, which is a fixed price, market-based price. So that's one of the nice things there. But yes, there are organizations. So I can also connect you if you're interested, particularly in that project.
So the voluntary market is an unregulated market, which means that as long as you're playing by the rules of the standard that you're trying to get to issue the offsets that you want, you have the ability to talk to anybody to trade, to sell those credits on down the chain. They could sell them to somebody else. And so what that means from a project perspective, if you've got a project in mind, you can start talking to somebody, you know, and there are investment companies that are specializing in carbon, and they've got all kinds of, they never have their own money, but they use other people's money, right, that they bring to the table, people interested in climate mitigation and carbon offsets. So you can start talking to those folks early on, or you can do your project, get your credits, and then take them out and say, hey, I did this great project, we've got these great credits with all these wonderful benefits in addition to carbon. And people pay more for that. I didn't talk about that earlier, but the price of carbon offsets that are linked to other benefits is much higher than just a straight, boring carbon offset.
Thanks, everyone, for your questions, and thanks, Steve and Steve. Very good. Thank you very much.